An elephant in Kenya once stood beside the body of her dead calf for 3 days. She would not leave. She touched the bones gently with her trunk, again and again as if checking something. For a long time, scientists called this instinct. Nothing more. But the more we watch animals near death, the harder that explanation becomes to believe. So the real question isn't whether animals notice death, it's whether they understand it the way we do. Let's start with elephants, because no other animal makes the case harder to dismiss. Elephants don't just react to a death in the moment. They return. Researchers have documented elephants visiting the bones of relatives years after they died. Not days. Years. They slow down. They go quiet. They touch the skull and the tusks with their trunks, gently, the same way they touch a living elephant's face. They will do this for bones that aren't even related to them, but they linger far longer, far more carefully at the remains of family. That's not curiosity. Curiosity doesn't come back. Calves matter most of all. A mother elephant who loses a calf will sometimes stay with the body for days, refusing to move, refusing to eat properly, touching the corpse over and over as if trying to wake it. Other elephants in the herd will gather around. They'll rumble low calls that sound to researchers almost like distress. Nobody is claiming elephants understand mortality the way a philosopher does, but something is happening in that stillness that looks less like instinct and more like loss. Now consider magpies. In 2009, scientists watched 4 magpies discover the corpse of another magpie on the ground. One by one they approached. They pecked gently at the body. Then they stepped back and stood there in silence for several seconds before one flew off and returned with a piece of grass, laying it beside the corpse. Then another did the same. The researchers who documented this called it, half-jokingly, a funeral. They didn't mean magpies understand death the way we do, but they meant something real was being marked. Something was being acknowledged that wasn't there a moment before. Chimpanzees take this even further, because chimpanzees are close enough to us that the resemblance becomes uncomfortable. When a chimp dies in a group, especially a mother or a close companion, others will groom the body. They'll sit beside it for hours. Some refuse to leave even as the corpse begins to change, as if some part of them is negotiating with what they're seeing. In one well-documented case, a mother chimp carried her dead infant's body for weeks, grooming it daily, long after it had stopped resembling the baby she'd known. That's not confusion. That looks like grief that hasn't finished happening yet. Dolphins add something stranger to the picture because dolphins seem to struggle with letting go in a way that looks almost like denial. Mother dolphins have been observed pushing the bodies of their dead calves through the water for days, sometimes using their own bodies to keep the corpse afloat, refusing every opportunity to swim away and rejoin the pod. Other dolphins in the group will sometimes circle nearby, taking turns staying close, as if standing watch. Marine biologists who study this behavior describe it carefully, almost cautiously, because the word grief carries a lot of human baggage. But they also admit that instinct doesn't quite cover what they're seeing either. A mother who has lost a calf to illness behaves differently than a mother whose calf simply swam off to explore. Something about permanence seems to register even underwater, even without hands, even without a face built anything like ours. But here's the part that complicates everything. Most animals show none of this. A deer that watches another deer die will often just keep grazing. A fish has no apparent reaction at all to a dead member of its school. Even animals that are intelligent in other ways, birds that solve puzzles, rodents that navigate mazes, frequently show zero behavioral change around a corpse. If death awareness were simply about intelligence, we'd expect to see it everywhere smart animals exist. We don't, which means whatever elephants, magpies, chimps, and dolphins are doing isn't just intelligence. It's something more specific, something closer to a concept. And maybe, strangely, the animals that walk away are the ones being rational. A deer that doesn't pause to process a death isn't failing to notice something important. It's surviving. Stopping to grieve in open grassland, surrounded by predators, is a luxury prey animals can't always afford. Evolution doesn't reward dwelling. It rewards moving on quickly enough to stay alive for the next threat. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe grief isn't a sign of higher intelligence at all. Maybe it's a sign of safety. Elephants, chimps, and dolphins all share something in common beyond brain power. They live in social groups with relatively few natural predators as adults. They can afford to stop. They can afford to linger. Grief, in other words, might be less about understanding death and more about having the evolutionary luxury to sit with it. So, what would it actually take for an animal to know it's going to die? Scientists who study this break it into pieces because knowing about death isn't one thing. It's several things stacked together. First, you need to recognize that a living thing can stop being alive. Second, you need to understand that this is permanent, that the dead don't come back. Third, and this is the hard part, you need to understand that the same thing will eventually happen to you specifically. Not to creatures, not to others, to you. Most animals that show grief-like behavior seem to clear the first two hurdles. Elephants clearly grasp that a body is no longer the living individual it once was. Otherwise, the searching, the touching, the lingering wouldn't make sense. But the third hurdle, understanding your own personal mortality, is far harder to prove. There's no test you can run on an elephant to ask, do you know this will happen to you? We can only watch behavior and guess at what's underneath it. And maybe that's the most honest place to land. Maybe death awareness isn't a single switch that's either on or off, human or not human. Maybe it's a spectrum, and different species sit at different points along it. A deer that walks past a corpse without pausing might genuinely register nothing. An elephant that returns to bones years later might understand loss in a way that's real, even if it's not identical to ours. And somewhere in between sit 1,000 species we've barely studied, each one possibly experiencing some fragment of what we'd call grief, without language to tell us so. Humans often assume our fear of death is what makes us unique, that we are the only species burdened with knowing the end is coming. But maybe that's not quite right. Maybe other species share fragments of that burden too, just without the words to dread it out loud, without the ability to lie awake at 3 a.m. turning the thought over and over. Perhaps what makes us different isn't that we know death is coming, it's that we can't stop thinking about it. So picture that elephant again, standing over bones that used to be family, touching them gently, again and again, the way you'd touch the face of someone you weren't ready to let go of. We used to call that instinct. Maybe it still is. Or maybe instinct was never a big enough word for what was actually happening there.